All right, so welcome and thank you for joining our session today, which is randomization and clinical supply management, the journey of a study. Today we have the pleasure to have different persons working on the group, and we'll be presenting you our solution for randomization and clinical supply management. We all have very busy days, so we are giving you 60 minutes of a good time today to go through the presentation and go through QA question at the end. If you move to the next slide, please. So in terms of small housekeeping, because of course, when we are running a webinar, we have a lot of participants, and we would like really to give you some tools and some ways to work. Of course, you will see we will have a polling questions coming up during the presentation. Your feedback will be highly appreciated because that's a way as well we can improve and learn from each other. You have as well actually the panel question where you can have a chat room where you will be able to raise your hand or post some question you may have, and we will answer them at the end of the call as well on the presentation. If you could remain on mute as well, like that we don't hear much noise. I know, nowadays it's pretty difficult still to work from different places, so we will look at that together. And you will receive as well a post-event survey to provide your feedback. This is the fifth presentation we are doing in the last 5 to 6 weeks, where we are covering different topics, and today it's randomization, and it will be a pleasure to provide as much as information as we can. If you go to the next slide, please. So today we have the pleasure to have James, who is our product manager for RTSM at Signant Health. So he will take the ownership of the presentation after a quick introduction from myself. So my name is Jean-Marie Olnet. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Signant Health, and I will be your maestro today for the presentation. Next, please. So poll number one, question number one, and you can answer using the system as well. In your organization, how is RTSM aligned? So you will see different answers. First answer is as a clinical operations system, supply management system, or as a data management system. Every organization is different, so we are really looking at your answers to have a good understanding about the panel and where we are here. Ultimately, those three departments or three systems are completely linked and talking to each other, and RTSM is really the centralized place for a lot of clinical development products that you are doing. So we will wait for a few minutes, or shall we move while people can vote? And we will see the answers after the presentation. So the agenda of today is going to be around a quick introduction, about 5-6 minutes introduction about Signant Health. And then James will enter into the topic of the day, which is RTSM. And talking about the primer functionality to look for in RTSM. What about the different studies, and what is the future of RTSM? Because randomization have been existing for 20, 30, 40 years, but of course the technology have evolved, and we will discuss about that as well afterwards. So if you go to the next slide, please. So Signant Health as an organization, we have been running clinical trials and supporting our customers for around 20 years in the industry. We are covering not only operational clinical, but we have as well a scientific and regulatory expertise internally. So we are really able to work with you and your team to make some advice, to bring the best combination of evidence generation with IP delivery and study enablement solutions. And of course, working in a clinical environment, you need to have validated software and an expertise to support flexible trials. A lot of people nowadays, we all hear about DCT, decentralized clinical trials, but the flexibility in your design is very important because there's nothing is in its stone. You don't have to do DCT. You can do different type of trials and bringing technology, combining technology like RTSM with ECOA and other solution. And of course, if you look at Signant Health as an organization, we have integrated solutions and to be able to offer the best user experience, not only for the patients, but as well for the end users, which are on the sponsor side or on the CRO side as well, and the investigator at the end. We talked a little bit about the expertise. Our experience today, as I said, we have about 20 years plus of experience. We have about 400 plus customers. We cover the world, different countries, depending on your trial. And of course, if you look at the therapeutic expertise, it's very interesting to look at the diversity. We don't have any specialties. We can answer any of the needs from the customers, different phase of your trial as well. Phase 2, phase 3, of course, are the prominent studies where you have randomization, but in phase 1, you have randomization as well. And oncology, infectious disease, if you look at today, the industry is really pushing to find some new drugs in those areas, but neuroscience, respiratory, and vaccine are really as well very busy for all of us. We are setting up about 600, a little bit more trials per year. That shows you the expertise that we have as an organization. The patient journey, data journey, a patient is entering into clinical trials, starting from site initiation, but of course, you have consenting of the patient that you have to bring in a trial. So we have solution, electronic consenting, for example, but you need to start to prepare your medication as well, and you can really start looking at the best way you're going to receive medication via the site or direct to patient at site as well. We are able to collect data through our ECOA solutions. You have sample collection. And of course, if you think about ECOA, you will bring some sensors and wearables nowadays, and especially with the pandemic, we were trying to simplify the life of the patient by coming to them instead of them to come to investigator sites. The clinician rating, telemedicine, can you go back, please? Telemedicine as well was something very obvious when you think about the telemedicine. Again, you still want to keep the link between the patient and the investigators. And trials can be run at home, at patient home, or at sites. There is nothing, in stone, written in stone in the way you run trials. It's really according to your protocol, the specific endpoint you want to collect, and how you want to run your trials, specifically around data collection, but as well medication shipment and management. Next, please. So let's look at the result of the Pole 1 in terms of in your organization, how is RTSM aligned? It's very interesting to see that supply management still lead, but clinical operation is becoming very strong as well. And we see that when we are talking to our customers. Sometimes some customers are saying, oh, it's our supply team who's handling it. But at the end, the impact of RTSM in the clinical operation is massive. So it's very important to bring those two departments together in order to talk. And very often we are becoming the link, or I'm not going to say the glue, but the enabler in terms of communication between the groups, because what's done in supply chain highly impacts the clinical operation and the clinical trials. So thank you for answering the poll number 1. So now I have the pleasure to introduce you with James. So James, here you go. The stage is yours.
I'll take myself off mute. Thank you, Jean-Marie. Yeah, hello, my name is James.
Maybe before we start, we had one first question, which was RTSM stands for. Can you please answer?
I will get to that. That's actually slide 11. Thank you for the question. It's an interesting one, and there's a reason that we do need to set the groundwork, which is why this first section is an RTSM primer. Now, just for introductions, just to say, my name's James Stringer. I'm based in the UK. I've been involved in the RTSM space for the last 20 years or so, for my sins. The white hair is not by accident, you know, what can I say? So if we can go on to the next slide, then thinking about what RTSM is, the abbreviation itself stands for Randomization and Trial Supply Management. As far as Signant is concerned, RTSM is the way that we brand what the industry has referred to over the years as they started by referring to it as IVRS because it was predominantly a voice-based system. We moved to our IWRS as we started to incorporate the web. Other instances call it IRT, interactive response technology, because there's an element of interaction and response. But as Jean-Marie rightly says, RTSM, or pick your abbreviation, has existed for 20 plus years, and it really started as a need to get control over and efficiencies in clinical trial design. Historically, randomization was performed effectively manually by packaging. That can be inherently wasteful, so you want to introduce a system so that you can introduce a bit more control and introduce a bit more and make use of supplies, do better data capture, all those sorts of things. The key thing, as a primer goes, is that whichever abbreviation you choose to pick, they actually all equate to the same system. There's fundamentally not a lot of difference, except if you want to equate the difference between what is a web and what is a voice interface. It's really about the only difference. The one thing that I think is definitely true over the years is that RTSM, or pick your system here, has evolved over time, whereas, you know, and I'm very careful to say whether there's been much revolution. It's been more evolution of the myriad platforms to meet the needs of the particular studies or the particular clients that we service. If we go to the next slide and we look further into the history of it, as I said, you know, these systems, they started as a means to make the clinical supply side of things more efficient, which points to the question that we asked at the start, though we'll get on to what that answer actually means in the future. So we started off with phone-based systems because that was the technology at the time. And you can use, and we were using those systems to enable better supplies, but also as the needs of studies started to evolve and the complexity of the needs of randomization became more apparent as different study designs became started to get introduced, we needed that computer-based ability. Then when you start to move through, we've expanded the functionality over the years. We've definitely started to integrate. We've interestingly and thankfully dropped the phone as a mechanism. The interesting thing is that, you know, where historically I've looked at the numbers for voice transactions, and I did a study once upon a time where we had to introduce the voice. We had 1,200 transactions in that study, of which 2 were done on the voice. I don't know what the percentage is, but I know that it's less than 1%. That was about 2010. If we take it further back, we ran the numbers sort of 2005-ish, and we had something like 97% done over the web even back then. So the voice definitely has thankfully gone away as a mechanism. And now actually we start to look forwards to, you know, patient apps and you know, mobile devices and all those good things that modern technology has brought us. But thinking further about the transition over the years for RTSM or these systems, over time, there's been a move from a more traditional sort of per study build to the notion of a configuration-based, or at least a configurable platform, where effectively you have a series of functionality that then you can use to adapt to the requirements of the particular study that you're trying to run. So you start to reduce the need for that per study programming and move to a configuration model. And there are reasons again for that, which we'll go into. As we start then to look forwards, and we'll look forwards a bit more, you know, and Jean-Marie touched on it, you know, there are a myriad of hot topics that the clinical trials industry as a whole has to start to look at, and RTSM in particular, for again reasons we'll get into, one of which being decentralized trials. The key thing is that, you know, RTSM has definitely evolved over the years and introduced more functionality, which is both a blessing and a curse as you start to go forwards. Okay, if we could have the next slide. So, and let me preface this question. So when RTSM, obviously being a system that, you know, pretty much every trial will end up using some derivation of this system, obviously subject to phase. We need to, what I'm interested in is when, as a sponsor, or indeed, you know, if you're vendor side, when would you prefer, or when do you think that you start to consider RTSM? Because there are multiple phases in the study. So if we pop the question up, you know, I'd like you to consider when you start to consider the needs of the RTSM in your organization. Now, the options, you know, we could do it right at the start during protocol design. We could do it before supply or packaging decisions have been made, or indeed we could do it after. There are a myriad of other points that I could have put on here, but we'll concentrate on the supply side to start with. And the reason for this question is to start, you know, at least from my perspective, there's a perception that RTSM is always on the critical path. But it's interesting thus to think about, or to understand, when RTSM is thought about, because again, there's a reason why we might perceive it as being on the critical path. On the assumption that that is being answered, do we want to skip ahead, please? Now, so based on my experience, my perception of when RTSM is involved in a clinical trial, you can see it's very much towards the end as we start to move from having an idea about a protocol all the way through to first patient in, which is ultimately when RTSM is going to start to be involved. It's my experience, and it's not a new one, and it's not unique to Signant, that RTSM is thought about later on in the design and the implementation of a study. And interestingly, it's later after some pretty major decisions have been made. If we go to the, that's why I think that RTSM is often thought about as being on the critical path, because we're leaving it till the last minute. Now, if we go to the next slide and we start to break down this flow in a bit more, into a bit more granular level, this is an intentionally busy slide because we can start to think about all of the decision points that are made during the key milestones within a study that could potentially have an impact on not just RTSM, but indeed any system that's used in the clinical trial. Now, depending on how we align RTSM, whether, going back to the question that we talked about before, whether we align against supplies or clinical operations, there are a lot of decisions that get made that will impact RTSM depending on which option you chose. So if we align RTSM to a supplies system, we often decide which supplies are going to be used for a study, how they're going to be packed, you know, what the fill count in a bottle is, or whatever else, which will directly affect how RTSM works. Well before we think about the RTSM design, if we are aligned to a clinical system, we will, or to clinical operations, then we'll think about the data that we need and how it's going to be captured and all those things, and yet leave the RTSM to the last minute. So you can see why there would be this perception that RTSM is on that critical path, simply because in the timeline of the study, we're leaving it to the last, almost to the last minute before we're up against that hard deadline of first patient in. Now, you know, whether that's a good thing or not, that's something that we could all debate. The key thing to think about is, you know, whether that's the right way to do things, or whether we should start to think about if RTSM can be involved earlier so that it can be a genuinely collaborative partner in the design of the study, rather than being at the mercy of those decisions that are taken ahead of time, which affect RTSM, but we have no role in defining. You know, so if we can then have the next slide. The other thing then to think about is that RTSM or IVRS or IRT or whatever else we want to call it sits in a landscape of a myriad of other systems, which again may or may not be affected by, of which RTSM might be affected by the decisions taken. You know, we can't say that RTSM operates in isolation, because it simply doesn't. And again, depending on when we start to develop RTSM, it's at the mercy of some of the decisions that have been taken, and it's not necessarily the case that it needs to. Now, all of this assume, you know, it may seem quite negative, but it's really about how we can do the best for the particular needs of the study, and most critically, the patient in the study. I mean, that's ultimately the key. You know, the general rule of thumb, if you ask somebody a question in this industry of who do we work for, we should all be working for patients. So we should all be trying to do the best job that we can, taking into account the patient at the end. But then, you know, we've got to be genuinely collaborative to do that. And perhaps that means that RTSM could be involved earlier in the timeline of the study, and, you know, be part of that wider landscape. Now, if that's my perception of, you know, when I think RTSM is involved, now hopefully the poll question has been answered. So I'd be interested at this point to know what you, the audience, think. So if we can go to that poll question, let's see if I'm right. Ah, that's interesting. So looking at this, it looks about an even split. So people, apparently we are involving RTSM, or at least thinking about RTSM during the protocol design, and indeed before the clinical supplies have been, decisions have been made. So I'd be interested to know from, you know, the comments, if you could, you know, put in the comments what you actually mean by that. You know, what thinking is done. Does the thoughts of RTSM affect your protocol design or your packaging design? I'd genuinely be interested to know that. Okay, so if we can move on then. So on the assumption that I'm completely wrong about how we perceive RTSM in the timeline of a study, let's hope that I'm not wrong about the thoughts of how, what sort of functionality that we should look for. So we go to the next slide. Now, my thoughts on RTSM is always a consent aside. RTSM is usually the first system that the system that creates a patient record. As we start to move to e-consent, you know, e-consent would genuinely be at the point of the pyramid. But my point here is that because RTSM is a genuinely site-facing system, and a lot of the others are not, that we've got to think about RTSM as the point of the pyramid. We absolutely can't think about RTSM in isolation. And what we've got to think about is that RTSM is a great mechanism to receive data into, and indeed send data to, other systems. You know, I genuinely do believe that it is that point of the pyramid, that, and so we should be taking advantage of it, which is why, at least my perception of leaving RTSM to the last minute, is why I think that that's potentially not the most effective way of working, because, you know, there's a lot of benefit there to what RTSM can bring. You know, RTSM can bring a lot of advantages. Specifically, it can start to reduce our site burden. The one thing that we know in the RTSM industry is that, ironically, we design these systems to work in a particular way, and yet we know that our users, our doctors, our nurses, whomever, they try and spend as little time as possible in these systems. And it's not unique to RTSM, it's the same for EDC and whatever else. You know, so the more that we can do to make RTSM more accessible and start to exchange data and reduce that site burden, we actually make those sites happy. You know, but on the assumption again that we leave RTSM to the last minute, and we know that it works in this wider landscape, you know, we're almost shooting ourselves in the foot to start with. We go to the next slide. So then, you know, again, we start to think about, we asked the question earlier about where should RTSM be positioned, and based on the answers that were given, it seems that you, the audience, definitely align RTSM to be a supplies-based system more than the others. A close second was a clinical system, and and that's definitely the answer that I would have expected, if I'm honest. The question then, of course, is, what should we do about that? What should we do with that knowledge? Is it right that we focus on one area of specialization, purely align RTSM to a supply system to one to the other? I don't think that we should, and I would hope that the answers for the reasons for that are obvious. If we go to the next slide, I personally would position RTSM as something that could potentially, or perhaps should, serve all three disciplines. And you'll note, the keen-eyed amongst you will note that I called the previous slide, where should RTSM be positioned? And now we're talking about alignment. And there's a reason for that, choice of wording, because when you look at the dictionary definition of positioning is just the act of placing. Where do you put it? Alignment is actually making sure that everything is in the right place so that your process works correctly, or at least as I read the dictionary. So actually, RTSM should definitely be aligned rather than positioned, because it has to work with all these myriad of different disciplines. The key thing, though, is, and as we start to move through this, the key thing is that RTSM, we need to think about aligning it correctly so that it meets the needs of the particular study. And that's the key thing, because it always devolves down to a study. It always devolves down to a study and then the needs of the patient within it. Secondary to that is definitely the needs of the sites, because as we said, if we think about RTSM as the point of the pyramid, our sites are the ones that are interacting with it. Even in a decentralized trial or a direct patient model, the sites will still be the primary consumer of RTSM. And so we've got to make that site burden and that investigator burden, that study nurse burden, as easy as possible. And so we've got to think about how best to use RTSM to make that burden less. If we go to the next slide. Now, that means that historically, when RTSM has been provisioned, and indeed when we look at how RTSM is even contracted, when you look at the vast majority of RFIs, RFPs, and what have you, we always see questions about, do you feature screening? Do you feature randomization? Do you feature insert functionality here? And so actually, we think about RTSM as a series of discrete modules, and that word module is used industry-wide, and it's never something that I'm particularly comfortable with personally, because module implies programming, and module implies code. And it's very much a programming term, at least in my world. It also speaks about degree courses and whatever else, but module is the incorrect word to use. Function is the incorrect word to use, and yet we think about these things as disparate requirements of an RTSM platform, and thus we think about those disparate requirements as for the needs of a particular study. Now, of course, RTSM has been very successful, and the Signant RTSM is very successful with that mindset in place. The thought is that, can we do better, especially, and thinking back to the history of RTSM that I talked about before, can we do better, and can we think about perhaps using, if industry has required that we go to a more configuration-based system, should we not think about RTSM as disparate modules, but should we definitely think about it as a more configurable platform? The reason that I suggest that, if we go to the next slide, is that the way that I think about RTSM is as Lego, okay? RTSM should be a set of functionality that you can bend or break to build something as simple or as complicated as you need. Now, I might want to build the Millennium Falcon because I'm a Star Wars nerd and I absolutely want to build the Millennium Falcon all the time. But the needs of the study might mean that you can create something simple. But the key thing is that you should be building it out of the same blocks. What we should be doing, absolutely, though, is making sure that we use the same blocks, regardless of whether it's something simple or something more complicated, and then use those blocks in the most effective configuration to meet the needs of the study. And that's not to say then that every particular study design needs screening and randomization and scheduled visits and all the other things that RTSM is usually thought of as requiring. You know, if we use the Lego analogy, we can think about, you know, and if your children are anything like mine, finding the right Lego brick is kind of difficult. You know, you need a 6x2 Lego brick. Yes, you could hunt in the box and find a 6x2 Lego brick. Lovely. But why don't you use a 5x2 and a 1x2? Why don't you use a 4 and a 2? Why don't you use a 3 and a 3? You get the same end. You just get it in a different way that might be both easier to provision and then most importantly, easier to maintain going forward. Same end result, different way of doing it. You're using your blocks effectively. A more realistic example for clinical trials, and again, just my opinion, because there might be good reasons why you don't do this, but if you think about an oncology study could run for years for a myriad of reasons. Most hopefully, that patients survive and just continue to need the medication forever. Now, from a technical perspective, and purely from a technical perspective, this means that I could build the RTSM in a way that I have screening and randomization and then a litany of scheduled visits, or I could build it with screening, with randomization, and then from a technical perspective, an unscheduled visit form. Now I know that that can be used forever, for as long as the patient is required to receive drug. It means that I don't need to concern myself with how many visits have I got in my study. Again, you're using the blocks that you've got in the most effective configuration to meet the needs of the study. And I think if we change our mindset to a point from that fixed set of functionality to blocks that we can use to reach or to create the configuration required by the particular study, we would ultimately serve our patients better. And that's got to be the key thing for me. So if that's my theory of how to build an RTSM, let's now look at the particular studies that and how they work in the real world. So if we can go to the next slide. So in the RTSM industry, and everyone's the same, and you can look at all the marketing from every vendor everywhere now, and it's done for a reason, and it's done for the right reasons, don't get me wrong, but we all focus on how do we get that first patient in, and it goes back again to how I perceive RTSM is provisioned. Late in the day, you've got a hard window of when the first patient in is concerned, so we concern ourselves with the functionality that's required today. We have the protocol, we meet the needs of the protocol, and we do it thinking about disparate functions. Okay, and that's very successful and that's very good. And you know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that approach. But you know, I like a good bit of creativity, and I think that there might be a different way. So if we go to the next slide, whilst we know that this is how we build up the studies, it from an RTSM perspective, what's the one thing that we know about studies, especially nowadays in the industry in which we work? We absolutely know that adaptable studies are the way that the industry is going. We absolutely know that the thing that you build to start with for your RTSM to meet the needs of first patient in is never going to be the thing that you finish with. We know that for every study, there's going to be a protocol amendment. We know that there's going to be a change of some description, which more than likely will affect the RTSM. So now if we're looking at individual functions and we're building for that first patient in, the question becomes, is that the right focus? It is, it isn't, you know, the opinions will vary. I personally, again, think that we as the industry, you know, and Signant as a vendor, we need to, you know, we can be a bit smarter about this. So, and the reason that I say that, if we go to the next slide, is very simple. The previous slide had an iceberg on it, and it had the top of the iceberg. The one thing that we know about icebergs is that the top is dwarfed by the tail. It's far longer. If we equate that then to our studies, if we're building for first patient in a period of weeks, absolutely our study is going to be used for months, if not years, and we know that it's going to be it's going to change. The tail is far longer than the top. So the thing that I think that we need to be mindful of, at least from an RTSM perspective, is that we build some resilience in knowing that things are going to change. The reason that I suggest that, and it's what we do at Signant, is to start to think about what will change in the future, because when you actually start to look at it, it's far better to build something today than it is to have to change things later when you start to get live patients in the study and you start to introduce some risk. And we can do that relatively straightforwardly because we have an understanding of the protocol and we have expertise within Signant and and indeed from the sponsor side. We can have an idea of what might change, and so we can start to think about, is it worth building in some resilience up front for the study to make that situation, once it's live, that situation of change, which we know is coming, less impactful for our study as it goes on. Now, the reasons why a study might change are myriad. We've put some on the slide there, but we have to reflect that studies are going to change in flight. It's inevitable. If we go to the next slide, please. Yeah, as I said, the thing of it is that we know that version 1, if we equate it into those terms of your study, things are always going to change. We know that as soon as you introduce change into a study that's live, there is a risk to that change. And we, in a clinical industry, we absolutely need to be aware of the risk. We know with anything that if you change something in flight, whilst it's in flight, it's far more expensive than it is to take a bit more time and build something that's a bit more resilient up front. And so the benefits of this sort of more expertise-based approach are myriad. It means that whilst we understand that there are going to be post-go live changes, of course there are, you can start to reduce that tail of the iceberg. You can start to use your Lego blocks in a myriad of configurations to achieve the best aim for the study. You can really start to use RTSM for what it should be on the assumption that everybody requests a configuration-based platform. Well, let's configure it. Let's use it. Let's use the power of the platforms that we've got, that Signant has, to its best opportunity. That's absolutely what we should do. The benefits should be obvious to everybody. Now, excuse me, all of this, of course, assumes that or suggests that I'm prompting for a change of mentality sort of industry-wide. I'm not advocating for that at all. What I'm advocating for is that we should all use our expertise. Our clinical colleagues absolutely know how their study is likely to change. From an RTSM perspective, we've got a large amount of experience, and Jean-Marie talked about it at the start of the presentation. Yeah, we have worked on many studies, so we have an idea of what might change. Let's discuss that change during that first build period, and let's try and build in that resilience, because it will benefit everybody, and that's what we're moving towards here. So all of this, it should be hopefully it should make sense to everybody, and I'd be interested in the questions from the audience. But we've got a tremendously powerful configuration-based platform. We've got a large amount of experience from all of the people involved in the trial. If we can involve RTSM a bit further, a bit earlier in the development of studies, and we can start to pool that expertise and use that expertise, we can genuinely get to a place where our studies and our RTSMs do exactly what they're supposed to do: meet the needs of the patient and make the site's involvement in the trial far easier. And that's where I would. If we can go to the next slide, then. Now thinking about where we want to end up in the future, of course, because RTSM, as I talked about, it's evolution, revolution, call it what you will. The next slide then, and you'll probably be thankful, the final slide, where do I see the future of RTSM being? Well, absolutely. I think that given the nature of the industry that we're in, we absolutely need RTSM to be mindful of what might happen in the future. And we've really got to get to a place where we start to reduce the need for change orders whilst a study is in flight. We're absolutely going to need change orders, of course we are, but if we can build something today, yes, it might be a bit more, it might mean a bit more time taken, but it's a lot less expensive to do it now than it is to do it in the future. So let's be mindful of that. We know that direct to patient is an absolutely hot topic, be it direct to patient or decentralized trials. The Signant RTSM is being developed and does at the moment support that last mile shipment, and that's going to be incredibly important, because as we move to direct to patient shipments, we absolutely need to have that complete chain of custody of drug, which is one of the things that RTSM is very good at providing. And we absolutely need an RTSM that's going to allow for the support of the differing regulations within within countries, because we know that even if we want to do a direct or facilitate a direct patient or a decentralized trial, not every country allows us to do that within its regulatory framework, but you still might want to conduct the trial in that country. So we want an RTSM that features that, and Signant is well on the way to delivering that. We know as well that RTSM data is becoming more important, and the regulators are starting to pay attention to the need to get that RTSM data in the hands of the investigator at the end of the study. So, from a Signant perspective, we're absolutely developing functionality that will allow for the retrieval of that, because the interesting thing when you read the regulations where that's concerned is they talk about providing the data, but inherently that study data has to be unblinding to be a complete data set. So now actually, to me at least, and to Signant, the important thing here is not necessarily the act of releasing the data, getting the data out there. It's actually the control of the release. So we want to have functionality to do that rather than releasing the data as is. And then in the future, I definitely see, again, thinking about reducing that site burden and and not so much a consolidation or anything else, but I see a future for RTSM as a service. There is a future where we don't necessarily need to give our sites yet another system to log into with yet another password and thing and stuff. Let's have RTSM as a service where, if RTSM is the point of the pyramid, we're talking about data exchange. Well, let's have data exchange so that you can squirt data into RTSM and then retrieve data out. And as far as anyone else is concerned, all they've pushed is a button in whichever system they happen to be using. So RTSM as a service, I absolutely see as a growth or as a need in the future of RTSM. Now, all of these things, it's very helpful working for Signant because all of these are on our roadmap. But I would expect that when we're thinking about RTSM industry-wide, these are the things that we absolutely want to target. Okay. As it happens, that was my final slide. I'll open the floor now for questions and answers if there are any.
I have a question for you, James, before we move to the question from our audience. It's more about any other functionality outside RTSM that you would see more and more common requests from customers, like inventory management, returns, of course, reporting solution on the top of those RTSM studies. Do you see that as a product manager? Do you see that as product request or functionalities that actually Signant Health are offering outside RTSM but with other solutions?
Yeah, I do. I mean, obviously the Signant RTSM features inventory management reporting, all of the things that you talk about. Where I see the need is if we're aligning RTSM as a supplies organizer to supplies, then it's interesting because forecasting, if we take forecasting for example, is a key piece of inventory management because you've got to plan what you're packaging up front.
Yeah.
The thing is, if you forecast, you actually need to feed back the actuals, because that's, you know, your forecast will be only as good as you put as the data that you put in. Your actuals will actually tell you whether that forecast was correct or not, and allow you to adjust your forecast in enough time to package new drug. So as far as, and that's why again we go to that sort of point of the pyramid, because absolutely the major touch point for RTSM from a supplies perspective is forecasting. Then, you know, from a supplies management perspective, there's another question of whether RTSM is the right place to do inventory management, or should it be linked to a proper ERP system for inventory management, you know, like the Smart Signals supply management tools that exist. You know, those are the sorts of inventory integrations that I see becoming more important. Okay, good. I think we have a question from David Stein, where the question, I will read it with my French accent. I agree completely that it's far superior to get it right at the start. Many sponsors have teams with incentives around FPI and not more important factors, such as the total of cost of trial, minimizing of change orders. The result is that study gets started quickly, often without building in greater supply chain efficiencies that could save hundreds of thousands of dollars. Have you seen a shift in sponsor thinking around such incentives? That's an interesting one, because obviously I sit on the product side of the fence, and though I've built 1,000 odd RTSM studies in my time across myriad vendors, I don't do the per study delivery at the as much as I used to. The thing is, I would hope so, is the answer to that, David. I honestly, I completely agree. I've observed that FPI is an incentived thing, and that's why there is a push to just meet FPI and don't worry about the rest. I think that we have to change that mentality if we're going to operate in an environment where adaptive studies are the norm, which, you know, that's my perception that they are. You know, we can't focus on FPI as a singular event, you know, and again, that goes back to that iceberg concept. We've got to change our mentality and think about the tail of the study. Or the pyramid as well, where you have RTSM on the top. Exactly. Yeah. You know, I mean, the simple thing is that if you're going for FPI, then you're always going to be focusing on a build period of weeks. We've got to move to the focus for the usage period, which will be in years, and that is across the board. That caters for what we physically build into the study to build in that resilience for those per study changes. Is about how we maintain the study, thinking about the data within it and how we manage that data. You know, that tail is far longer than that initial build period, and that's the key thing for me. Okay, and we have another comment. I think it's maybe from David again. Managing product supply takes time in decentralized trial, and sometimes more time when the randomization scheme is complex. How do you build that buffer time in your decentralized trial protocol? We try to build this time into protocol, but when shipments are delayed, it can cause problems with the timing of first dosing. That's from Adam. From Adam, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting one, and that depends on how we think about those sort of decentralized trials. At Signant, the functionality that we're putting into the platform is to enable the configuration of the type of visits that you're going to be doing and how you're going to use the supplies. And I look at how we would reduce the delay and reduce the sort of first dosing by thinking about how we design the study in the first place. So I come back to thinking about, if we think about a direct-to-patient trial, you've got to think about the visit design. You know, is the visit being performed at the site, at the home, or indeed, is it a hybrid visit where you do not know the answer to that site or home question up front? But it's all well and good defining the visit design at a study level. You need to be able to define it at a lower level to deal with the per country regulations, because, you know, different countries have different frameworks where you might not be able to do home visits. The second part to that, though, is you can't just think about the visits. You've got to think about the supplies. Where are the supplies being allocated from, and where are they going to? So effectively, to reduce the that sort of buffer time or those delays to shipments, if you think about it in three parts: where's the visit happening? Where are you allocating the stock from? Where are you sending the stock to? Actually, you can design the study to be efficient in what it sends and where, so that you can avoid some of those issues around first dose. You know, so I envisage a future, and this is what we're building towards at Signant, where you can define what you want at a protocol level. You can define what you might know today about how your individual countries are going to work. But then while your study's in flight, let's have a mechanism where we can adjust what we thought on the fly, because it's built into the platform, so that we don't have to do per study change orders, so that we've got the configurability, because that's the key word, that we need to reduce all of the concerns that I think Adam's got. Hopefully I've answered your question, Adam.
Thank you, Richard. That's great. Okay.
Good enough.
Is there any last question from the audience? So I really hope so that today, you know, you really had a great overview of what we are offering, and I would say the randomization world in general in the industry. Maybe we have some last question about should an RTSM study directly match the protocol design in all cases? That may be because again, it's you try to match everything, but
yeah. And again, I mean, there are good reasons to match the protocol, and especially if we think about things in that integrated world, because if we have alignment based on the protocol, then every system, you know, the integration touch points might be easier. But depending on the type of study that you've got and the building blocks that you've got in your RTSM provision, there are good reasons not to. You know, again, if I go back to my oncology thought, where I could, from a technical perspective, screen, then randomize, then just unscheduled visits forever. Yeah. You know, I could then, you know, build in, I don't know, a drop down of for which visit are you performing this, have it as pre-programmed for the visits that I know about, and then if I had to do a per study you know, an in-flight change, now I'm just adding more rows to a drop down. I'm not changing dispensing. I'm not changing the risky areas. I'm still aligned to the protocol, but I'm aligned in a slightly different way than the conventional wisdom would have.
Okay, yeah.
You know, so I guess, yes, we should align to the protocol if we can, but perhaps we can do it in different ways.
Yeah. And if we add more complexity into the initial build, have you seen in your experience the impact on go live, or because that's
and I think it touches on the question or the statement about FPI being an incentivized milestone. And I think that the question that we've got, you know, if as the poll question would assume, we start thinking about RTSM earlier. Maybe I should have worded the question, when do we start to involve RTSM? Mm-hmm. If we involve RTSM earlier, then actually we can put in more complexity perhaps and still meet that FPI. And again, think about reducing the impact or the changes required once the study is in flight. So for me, it's not necessarily, you know, if we build in more, will it impact study go live? If we start to involve RTSM earlier, no, it won't. And then we get the benefits from the tail. So it's sort of a, you know, we can still hit that incentivized first patient in, you know.
But on our side on Signant Health, we see more and more sponsors who are coming to get packages, I would say, or bundle offering where you start straight away with RTSM, with eCOA, or electro e-consent at the same time. Like that, you can get the benefit of having one team, one project manager or program manager, and start early, because it's true that very often RTSM is coming at the last minute, trying to catch up. But of course, for the optimization of the flow of the implementation and the team at Signant Health, for our case, it's much better in that way.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of the bundling thing, to genuinely think about the study as a whole and not the disparate parts, because that again is, that's the key thing. It is a study. The fact that we have all of the systems that I started to talk about, they've all got to work together. So yeah, the bundling concept, which is why it exists, to get that all the key stakeholders involved earlier, that's the beauty of it for me.
But it's linked to who owns RTSM, because the first question on our presentation today was, is it clinical operation or is it supply? And very often when we see it's not clinical operation, it's coming late and we are not able to engage the customer for ECOA or EDC at the same time at RTSM. That's why it's very important that our sponsor friends are coming closer and closer between supply and operation, because
and that's why, again, thinking about the supplies, that's why, that sort of 3-block those demarked areas, I don't think that works. I think, whether it's RTSM or whether it's insert system here, they have to be at the center of all of the 3 other disciplines and work together. That's the key thing. We have to collaborate.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you very, very much, James, for managing that webinar, and I hope our attendees had a lot of learnings and benefit, and we look forward to have them on board for the next webinar that we will be setting up. And I would like to wish all of you have a great day, a great evening, and see you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.